Hi, this is Thomas Elblom. This is the third video of diving into the architecture of Habitat. In this video, we'll look at the layered architecture and how the different layers in Habitat fit together to create the overall solution, and how the modules and the different layers interact with each other. So this is another part of the very foundational aspects of Habitat is flexibility. Now, flexibility is about ultimately productivity. It's about for every change we make to a project, we know what to test and what we're affecting. So we're very clear on that we don't break other things when we're changing things, that we can add functionality in one aspect without having to change a lot of other things. And in this aspect, the coupling of all the modules is really essential, and how the references work between the different modules. Now, one of the aspects is of course to go from loose references to hard references, because every reference counts. So if we've got a string that refers to a field in another module, then that reference is just as important as a reference to from one assembly to another, which is a hard reference. So because you cannot change module A without changing module B in any case. So hard references and loose references are all references. So what two of the principles that underline this is the stable abstractions principles that defines how abstract and how stable the modules are. We'll look into that, and then the layering or the references downwards, so that we reference stable, more stable modules from our more volatile modules. So one of the package principles, again, I urge you to go and look into package principles and read up about that. An abstraction, the abstractness of a package should be in proportions to its stability. So if we've got an API level, so just imagine, having an API. So if you have an API, you have a very clearly defined interface to that API. Whatever goes on inside it is really doesn't matter. So that's a highly abstract piece of functionality. Whereas if you think of the website or the graphical design, all those things are very volatile, and it changes all the time, and it has great ramifications on how the other modules are, or the other modules that it's using. And again, it's about testability. It's about abstracting away things that is not important to the other modules. It's about clearly defining the couplings between the modules. Now, project specific, like page types, designs, they're very concrete. You can't really make that abstract. It has to be very specific to a solution, and it's highly volatile. Every time you do a change, you always change the design, more or less, or you always change the visual appearance. You always change, if you add a button somewhere, you need to style it so it looks good in the context. And if you create a new feature, then you have to create some page types to be able to navigate to that feature. So all the project specific modules are very concrete. Now, the domain logic has concrete features. So like the news module or the search module has a very concrete implementation, but it's abstract to the solution. So from a page type perspective, when you put on a search box, then it really isn't important for the page itself how that search box is implemented. So it's abstract from a project or solution perspective. It's a search box, it's a search result, but it's concrete in that it has a very specific functionality. And then, of course, in the framework layer, those are very sort of abstract and highly stable parts. So, and one of the concepts that we can use to for example, to abstract things away is template inheritance. We'll look into that. So Another principle is the stable dependencies principle. And again, it's a very obvious one, is that in order to test things and to make a solution stable, you need to depend in the direction of stability. You need project A or module A and module B. If module A depends on module B and module B changes, then module A has to be tested, or in some cases it has to be changed. Whereas if module A changes, then module B is really not important. You don't have to test module B because there's no reference from B to A. There's only from A to B. So in that case, it's really important that the stable one is module B. The one that has the most references needs to be the most stable. So again, having the framework defined, and it comes down to, again, the structure of your modules and some of the other principles in what you put inside the module. So let's say, for example, you choose to put the visual design for every feature inside the feature. So the visual design of the news element, the visual design of the search box, the visual design of the logo goes inside of each of those modules. But the problem is the dependencies for visual design is quite big. If you change the width of the news list and the color of the news list, you probably also have to change the color of everything else, because color is it's consistency things, right? And the width of if you change the width of an element on the page, it affects the other parts of the page as well. So you need to change the other parts of the page. So again, if you add a highly volatile part to your module, like the CSS, then your whole module becomes highly volatile, meaning that every time you have to change that module, you'll have to change everything else. So it's about what you put inside the modules that makes it either stable or unstable, and also the references, and of course that defines the references or the dependencies. And remember, every dependency counts here. It's not only about hard code references or class references or function references. This is about every reference that goes out. So, and actually, when we talk about abstracting our abstractions and architecture like this, one thing to keep in mind is still keep it simple, because there's a lot of very complex patterns and practices out there that can really make a whole solution very, very difficult to work with. And like the dependency injection, inversion of control, very, very clever things, but it's not a very common pattern and practice, which means that there's a high learning curve. So in that case, think of whether these patterns and practices are necessary, and whether the abstractions can be made in another manner, and basically just keep it simple. So let's look at how modules are referenced from each other inside Sitecore. So let's look at again the navigation and the news project. So the navigation project has, as we mentioned before, have breadcrumbs, menus, that kind of thing. The news project has a news article. It also has teasers that are put on other pages, like the latest news, which are put on the front page. The news list, which is basically the list, a news list page type component, and then a news teaser, which is one promotion that points to a news list. Now, those four components are used on different page types around the website. Now, as I mentioned a couple of times before, page types are defined not in the domain layer, but in the project layer, and they're defined in the website project. So the website project here contains, or is what ties all the renderings and the layouts together. So that's effectively what creates the website. So in here we've got, in the views, we've got layouts. So if we dive into the layouts here, we'll see there's one default layout, and then there's sort of a more bootstrap-like column sub layout where you can put in different columns configurations, and then we've got the footer and the page heading, and then we've got a page sidebar, which is sort of a left-hand side page content type layout. So if we dive into Sitecore here, we'll see that inside here we've got the in layouts, in under layouts we've got Habitat, and we've got website, which is the only one that has a layout. Under renderings we've got again Habitat, and here we've got all the sub layouts defined. So how do we tie that all up together? Now let's say a news list, for example. A news list page type is not just a news list. So if we look at the website, so let's look at our news list here. So down here we've got the latest news, so this is the latest news box. The latest news box refers to a news list, so if we click on the read more, we come to a news list. Now the news list widget or rendering is just this element here. So basically the news list page type, which is the whole thing, has references to a lot of different things. It has references to logos, navigation, link bars up here, the navigation breadcrumb, the page title, the secondary navigation, and the footer. So effectively, if we were to put the news page type inside the news module, then the news module would have references to everything. Because as I've said many times, a reference is a reference is a reference. Hard references, loose references, they all count. It basically means that every time we change something on, let's say if we decide to change the left menu, then we need to change the news project because we're changing the navigation module. So what we do is we pull out all the page types into one central place, which is the website project. So we go into the project here, to the website project, and in here we have all the page types. So these are pages that can be created by an author. So very conveniently, these are all centralized. So we manage all the page types within one location. It's very easy to go through all the pages and change, renderings and layouts and insert options and all the things that we commonly have to configure. So if we look at the news list, one thing we noticed is the news list templates has no fields. So a page type in itself doesn't really have any content because it's derived from content in the domain, in a domain module, as for example the news list. So if we look at the base templates on this, then we'll see that it has a title, which makes sense because that's this latest news one up here. It has a summary because we can link to it from a reference, from a promotion or a teaser. It has navigation, so it'll show up in navigation, in navigations around. It has metadata. It has assets, which are like JavaScript and those kind of things, which is a central framework component. It has social, Open Graph, Facebook metadata. And it is a news folder, and the news folder template is defined in the news module. So that is what the news module uses to find out whether that template is actually a news list or not. Likewise, if we go into the layout design, then we can see, wrong one. Of course, on the standard values. So if we go to the design layout, then we'll notice that all the renderings here are put on this page. So we have everything defined, and in here is the news list. So there we go. So that's what creates the news list. And it's put into the sidebar content, and the sidebar content, we know about that because we have a content, where's that? The page sidebar page layout. So again, tying all the different components or renderings from all the different modules together all happens in the website project. Likewise with the design project. So the design project is the other part of the project layer. Design project is where we have the CSS, the visual elements of JavaScript, and in Habitat we're using Sass. So this is the Habitat CSS or Sass file, and it uses Bootstrap. So it has Bootstrap here, and it overrides some of the default settings in Bootstrap, and then it'll override some of the other things, because effectively design is not designed for one rendering on the page. Design is for the whole page. You have to look at it from whole page perspective. You cannot design every rendering by itself. Okay, so layered architecture. So the most important part of layered architecture is to keep track of references and keep references internal. So as many of the references you can keep them internal in the project. So for example, in the news list, the only awareness that the news list has of Sitecore is because the page refers to the news folder template. So instead of the news list referring to the template, the page type template, it refers to a base template. Loose coupling is really your enemy. Keep everything as hardly coupled as possible. It makes it a lot easier to maintain. It makes it a lot more discoverable. One of the aspects to consider is inversion of control. So inversion of control, I know I earlier mentioned that it's one of the complexities, and it does add complexity, but sometimes this complexity is necessary because we have references that we don't want in the project. And again, references and coupling between modules is eventually what stifles productivity, what makes you go slower and slower and slower. So IOC is very handy for those kind of references where you need to refer between different modules. So for example, let's say we have a navigation or a search, for example. So the search searches across many different page types. And when we're on the search list, we need to be able to show a we need to be able to show a title. Now the simple and ugly way would be for the search module to know about every other module. So we know it's a news list. We know it's a content page or an article or a news page, and then we show it accordingly. Now that would create a lot of references, and eventually it would mean that changes to every module would mean changes to search. So so at this point, what we do is we would pull out part of it. We pull out part of search into a framework component. So in this case, call it indexing. So that is what keeps track of indexing all the different page types. So all the different page types can now, or content types, so call it news content or article content or whatever it is, product content, can all register themselves as being indexed. So that way we pull out the central part, the stuff that indexes the pages, into a framework component, and then search uses that and the other elements uses that. So suddenly we have just one reference. The other part that makes for very loose coupling is HTML and CSS. Keep your HTML as semantic as possible. Again, define in your HTML what it does, not how it looks. So don't refer your classes to things like left menu or top menu or bold text or green text, because down the line that creates a reference to a very specific location on the page, like on the left hand side, or a specific color, a green color. But eventually you don't really know that, do you? Like if you have a search box and button is green, do you know it's going to be like that in every project? Not really, right? So keep it as semantic as possible. Make it a call to action button. And in that case, make the design, the project, define what color is a call to action button. And again, coming back to the common functionality framework modules, instead of either having references across different domain modules, keep those references in the framework. And finally, building modules doesn't have to be complex. This architecture is definitely not about complexity. It's about simplicity. It's about keeping it as simple as possible to achieve that goal that you want. So a couple of rules of thumbs. So project layer, so on the top layer, we typically only see two different modules. The website module, which ties everything together, sets up the layouts, ties all the page types together with all the renderings. These two modules are very concrete and specific to the solution. This is probably where you're going to end up doing 75% of your work. You're going to configure the website project, you're going to fiddle with the design and all that. So it's very concrete and very specific. If you want to tailor a demo or create a proof of concept, this is basically 99% of the work is going to be up there. We could potentially have multiple websites. So if we have a multi-site solution or a solution that have multiple graphical design themes, which are very different, then we could have two design components and somehow we could toggle between them. And one of the important things is don't be type centric. So CSS is definitely related to design, but JavaScript is not related to design only. So if there is functional JavaScript, things that make your light box pop up, for example, that is not design JavaScript. That JavaScript belongs in the domain module. It doesn't belong in the design module. So split out those things as much as possible. And don't put business logic in the project layer. If there is any business logic, if, for example, you have the ability to select themes on or graphical themes on your website, so choosing different color themes, all that, then create a domain layer module called theming, so that all the business logic of selecting what theme and the templates where you select you edit the color codes, things like that, goes in the domain logic or in the domain layer. So, secondly, the domain layer modules, the middle layer, the feature layer, so to speak, it does not reference the project layer ever. Now that's the worst kind of reference is if you start to have dependencies between the domain layer and the project layer. If you start putting in CSS in the domain layer, things like that, because then this whole architecture really doesn't matter. Now the domain layer is concrete in terms of functionality. You have to be very specific. You're building a news article, so just focus on building news stuff. Don't put everything else in there. It's just about news, but it's abstract. You define a news list, a news teaser. There's no need for the project layer to know that it's a paged list or what it is. And as much as possible, try to avoid referencing the other domain layer modules. So don't reference across modules, even within a layer. This is probably one of the hardest things to accomplish, because this is where it gets tricky, especially when there's a crunch and then you suddenly go, oh, I'll just refer to this field over here. If you do, then at least keep it a hard reference. Don't do a loose reference. Again, no CSS, no design JavaScript in the domain layer. Keep the semantic HTML as semantic as possible. Don't put in design HTML that are focused on what color it is. And then configuration files. So keep the configuration files in the modules. Don't put the configuration of a domain layer. So if you're layer requires indexing, if your domain module requires indexing, don't put the indexing in a configuration file in the project layer or in a project module. Keep it in the domain module. The third layer, framework layers, it's pretty much only APIs. There are some cases where you have some data in there, but it is typically an API only layer, and it's very abstract and generic. And again, don't reference up. Reference the underlying software, and don't put renderings in the framework. Renderings belong in the domain layer because it's related to the functionality of the website or the visual appearance of the website, and that is all domain layer specific.